Welcome to Channel Edge, the podcast where channel leaders share success strategies, best practices, and emerging trends. Brought to you by 360 Insights, the channel success platform.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Channel Edge, 360 Insights view into everything channel. I'm your host, Stephen Kellum, and want to thank you guys all for joining us today as we talk about sales and sales in the channel. And super excited to have Tiffani Bova, who is the global growth evangelist for Sfdc, joining us today. So welcome, Tiffani.
Thank you, Stephen, for having me. It's my pleasure.
Yeah, I'm super excited to have you because we cover a lot of things in our podcast for our folks in the channel. And it seems like we talk about marketing a lot, and we talk about operations a lot, how to get the most out of the channel. But interestingly enough, we don't talk about sales enough. And I was looking at some of the things that you were speaking of and that you talk about. And obviously with Salesforce, sales is implied in it. And I'm not so sure that sales in the channel gets the love that it does on the enterprise side and is talked about as much. So curious what you think about that.
Well, first and foremost, I'm bullish on anything sales, right? It's like I oversimplify, but I think businesses do two things. They make stuff and they sell stuff. Right? That's kind of like, that's business 101, right? You're either going to make something, and in the channels world, they may not make it, but they're responsible for selling it and selling it either with or through the vendors that are providing the products and services for them. And so without that kind of reach and scale, many of those vendors would not absolutely have the revenue numbers and growth rates that they have. So I think it's really critical for technology providers and really companies in general to really look at those third parties as a competitive weapon for them. If they do it really well, they're able to scale faster than those that don't.
Well, isn't that Larry Ellison's quote? Didn't he walk with someone in the office somewhere and said, "Hey, what do? You either make something or you sell something." I think that goes all the way back to Larry.
Yeah, I actually think it was before him, but it doesn't matter.
I'm sure it was, but he borrowed it.
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's like it's just so basic. Now, some people will go like, "Oh, it's more than that," and I'm like, And where it gets funny on that, it's more than that. Is if you don't make the product, right? So if you don't make the product and you sell the product, then what is your role? It has to be in the value wrapped around that product, which is a sweet spot for the channel, obviously. And also your ability to be really good at selling, which is the second side of the coin, that if someone else is making it, your role is to sell it.
Well, that's kind of interesting. I was going to ask you, where do you view sales? I think you probably just said that, on the hierarchy, right? Because when you look at the value of the channel, actually, I'm going to take you back. By the way,
let's do that.
I'm going to take you back because Tiffani and I met 12 years ago. I was running an MSP. We were in Orlando, Florida, and I was sitting there and I just showed up at an MSP, and I'd been hired at this MSP, and I didn't know hardly anything about technology. And the owner, when he hired me, I said, "Look, I know where that IT guy sits, but I'm a sales guy." And he said, "That's great," because what he was trying to sell wasn't a product, right? He was trying to sell a service. And MSP was trying to wrap what he did around that. And so it worked out really well. But I met Tiffani there, and she was the person there for Gartner as far as, hey, where are things going in the channel? So it was a little different introduction. And we weren't maybe talking so much about sales then. There was a lot of other pieces we were talking about.
Well, if you want to sort of throw down the MSP card, I'm going to really go back in time. So I was part of Intel's managed services network. There was 5 of us in 2000, 20 years ago.
Wow.
20 years ago. And it was myself, Alvaca Networks. There was a handful of us others. And they were trying to figure out, back then, Intel was saying, look, if MSPs, back then it was kind of white boxes and server storage. And, how are you going to remotely monitor and manage people's data centers? And the technology was not there yet. Silverback and all these sort of technologies that ultimately was bought by Dell was not there. And so the channel was having to figure out, how do we do this? As the technology caught up, the channel was much more equipped. Sales become much easier. The value prop became much easier. And then I left sort of the traditional side and landed at Gartner, as you mentioned, for a decade. And then MSPs were kind of in my coverage area. So it's been an interesting journey watching how it's evolved over the last 20 years.
Well, and one of the reasons I want to go down that path a little bit is because I was going to ask you how important you think sales is to the channel. And I wanted to give a little bit of history on kind of where I looked at things 12 years ago and where you looked at it, because there's sales, there's the top of the funnel, the marketing, There's the product enablement piece. There's so many pieces. There's the loyalty side to it. And there's all different kinds of technical resellers. Hey, and by the way, Tiffani, our audience cuts across many, many verticals. There's technologies to tires, right? And I think sales and how this works in the channel plays across all of those as well.
Well, when I used to explain to my mom, what do you do exactly, right? And he'd be like, okay, how do I explain the channel to my mom, right? Because you'd be like, oh, you're a channel chief. What does that even mean, right? I said, well, I'm going to use ketchup. She's like, what? I go, Heinz ketchup. You cannot go to Heinz.com and buy ketchup. You have to buy it from a real retailer. I help the people like Heinz ketchup get their products on the shelves so that people like you can buy it. It's just my ketchup happens to be technology. She go like, oh, okay, I get it. So sometimes you just have to bring it down to what the brass tacks of what is it that you're doing. And there's only really, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think there's only one technology company left on the planet. Maybe that's a little dramatic, but one big one in Cisco that you can't go to Cisco.com and buy technology. Right. And so, because so much of their product, 95, 96% probably goes through the channel. The rest is maybe a direct sell to telcos, which is another form of their channel. And so I think that it has just predominantly been a way for all industries, real estate, insurance, to actually scale through, they use agents, right? Or licensees or franchisees. It's always been, how do you scale the business and get talent out in a way that's affordable for you from a profitability standpoint, but also making it easier for your customers consume your product, whether it's ketchup or whether it's a multi-million-dollar technology deployment.
So, and so back to my question. So how important on all of those, so how important is sales versus those other pieces? And one of the reasons I asked that is because we're in an incentive business. We see lots of incentives around the top of the funnel of marketing, lots of incentives around enablement on MDF. And we see sales for an attainment level, but not really digging into how do you connect and how do you help them sell. So to me, there's like this gap. Because we want to reward you for selling really high, and then we're doing some things on enablement to get you there. But I don't see as much around, all the pieces that you've been talking about to help the channel adjust today into how to sell well.
So this has always been a really interesting challenge for me. If I put back on my Gartner analyst hat, and then I just talk about when I was a channel chief and now sort of when I'm on the vendor side, but really focused in on helping brands grow, is the fact that I agree with everything you just said, Stephen, but I also have to hold accountable that the channel has to do their job in making sure that they know how to sell and they're enabling their people to sell, regardless of whatever the vendor, provider, company does for them to help them sell. Like MDF dollars or co-op funds or training and certification or lead distribution or all that stuff. It's like, regardless of what that vendor or company does for you, you have to do it anyway, right? And where I always got a little conflicted in giving advice back then was how much of it is the responsibility of the company versus how much is the responsibility of that channel when it comes to selling, literally. Finding their own leads, hiring their own salespeople, training their own salespeople. What tools do they use? Pipeline management, forecasting, like all of that stuff cannot be that, well, I just do this and you have to do all this for me. The reason that they're working through third parties is also to reduce the SG&A, which is the sales and general administrative costs or the cost of goods sold, the COGS on it, right? So ultimately, it's like, who's absorbing that? If the vendor has to absorb all of it, what is the value of the channel? Is it just the last mile, meaning they have the customer relationship that the provider doesn't have? But I feel like it is a joint responsibility of making sure that you are enabling and making capable your people to sell, right? And I use that in a very big box of a comment. But the whole concept of I just do the last mile and I kind of just, let's go back in time. The channel used to be, accused of just fulfillment and adding no value. We've spent decades trying to get the channel to not be viewed that way because we always knew they were doing more than that. And so I don't want to slip backwards and say the same thing, that it's still the responsibility of the provider. Sales is one area, to your point, that I think, and marketing, both sales and marketing, have been areas where the channel historically, and I'm making a general statement because obviously not everybody does this, is still very reliant on what the companies will do for them.
Well, I think that kind of goes back to the person who hired me when I went to MSP, when I told him, hey, look, I don't really know that much about IT. I know about selling. He goes, you're perfect. He goes, I sell risk mitigation and business continuity. I don't actually sell individual products. And I was like, well, I can sell that. That actually works. So he was smart enough to, as an MSP, this was 10 years ago, to hire, and we ended up hiring insurance salesmen. We didn't even hire people who worked in tech space. We knew people who sold risk mitigation, and it worked really, really well. I think that's an interesting proposition. How much do you help? But I think it's really hard because we keep hearing about new channels and new routes to market and taking advantage of new ways to get there. And whether you're bringing on accountants or whoever you're bringing on, a lot of times historically, sales and growth is maybe not their strength. Maybe they just sold on relationships, or they weren't very good at really growing substantially. And so is it just buyer beware? If you're going to expand on that or expect it, what are you willing to put into it? And here's my second question on that. Why wouldn't you give them the ability to access the training materials that you wouldn't give your direct force anyways? And so many things you talk about are how do they empower their direct force? Why can't you just move a lot of that over into the channel?
That fair point. Sure, you should. But as a channel company, don't just rely on that as your only means of getting it, is my point. So there has to be a balance between the two, right? There has to be that balance. And so, I often say, so let's just pick managed services as an example. The very early managed service providers that were super, super successful got into managed services before, like I was saying, there was the technology no one had an MSP program. The big tech providers did not have one. IBM didn't have one. Dell didn't have one. HP didn't have one. Compaq, I'm going to go back, right? Did not have one. But those early MSPs, kind of 2000 to 2005, were able to say, if I can take the break fix business, which was, something breaks, you deploy a truck, it's $150 an hour. If I can do it differently, and now that we have the advent of the internet and I can remotely get in there and I only roll a truck 15% of the time when there's a hard failure, it's better profitability for me. Those early movers set the stage. Everybody else kind of waited for the manufacturers to come up with, what's the program? What's the incentive? What's the training? What's the certification? What's the technology? Those early movers were way, way ahead. And so you could think that about the channel that embraced cloud early on, the cloud Sherpas and Aperios of the world. The big global SIs were not paying attention to cloud providers, including Salesforce. The only ones that were these born in the cloud digital natives who started companies saying, we think this is the direction it's going to go. And then all of a sudden, when the market started to pull and go, if the clients are saying they want cloud, all of a sudden, all the big channel companies said, it's all about cloud, And so you either are going to wait, or you're going to say, especially now, let me go back to sales. If you had invested in selling virtually and using video 2 years ago, how much better of a position would you be in today than trying to scramble to get people to figure out, I'm talking now sort of February, March, April, May on a global basis, when all outside sellers became inside sellers. If you had already had that in place and they were trained and enabled and you had the technology and you had the processes in place, how much better of a position were you in versus those that went, oh my goodness, like, how am I going to get all my field sellers to be inside? What do we need to do? And how do we deploy video? And what are we going to use? And you can see the vendors that offer video products that didn't have it really leading in their technology, right, or in their product portfolio, all of a sudden put their foot on the gas to try to catch up to, the Zooms of the world that had already sort of figured out what are we going to do. And that Zoom was founded by someone who was the product lead at WebEx. So, right, enterprise grade, all the things that went along with that, and said, wait, hold on. How do I make it democratize and available to everybody? Salesforce, big CRM, on-prem, long-term deployment, 2-3 years. How do I make it as easy as buying a book on Amazon, enterprise grade software? born is SaaS, born is Salesforce.com. So, ultimately I try to pull those parallels together to say, you can wait for vendors to give you what you think you want and need, or you can say, what can I do on my own? Whether they do it or don't do it, I believe this is the direction for the company.
So interesting, you mentioned in that an early on point was the digital natives, right? And so once again, we cover up from insurance to tires to technology. There's a lot of markets out there that have a lot of digital adopters and not digital natives. Maybe we can even go that side for a second. And I think they're going to need maybe even more help today. So maybe we can spin it forwards to, in today's market, how does this really apply? Because we're talking about, yes, the vendor needs to do something, and yes, the partner needs to do something. Obviously, we just hit a big glitch. Nobody thought 2020 was going to be, you can't go meet in person anymore. And by the way, I think it's going to stay that way for a while, right? And we can talk about that. But now there is this paradigm shift, and how much of the responsibility is that on the partner or dealer agent versus the vendor? Because I'm seeing some industries where the partners are actually leading the vendors in what needs to get done versus the other way, like an insurance.
But same with MSPs, that's what happened, right? They're like, no, I don't want to do it anymore on-prem. I don't want the break fix. I don't want you to give me those leads. So going back to using another industry besides technology, I'll just pick on restaurants based on what I just described. For the restaurants industry, for those of them that did not have their menus online, did not have relationships with Uber Eats or Grubhub, did not know who their customers were, and then the pandemic hits. What do? Oh my goodness, I have to get my menu online. Like I have to, you know what I'm saying? I have to now create this relationship. And there was a restaurant close to me that I used to say to him all the time, like he had old cash register. I'm like, you've got to get point of sale. It was painful for me, right? Because I've been in tech my whole career. And I had the whole conversation with him about Uber Eats. He's like, no, we like people to come into the restaurant. Sure enough, it took him almost 90 days to get everything sort of up and running. And his restaurant per se, has been on multiple reality TV shows. I live in Hollywood, so you can figure out which ones they are. But so he just got a ton of business that way. Now, all of a sudden, it's closed down. And he also did not know who I was, right? He didn't know who his clients were. So Tiffani might come to dinner every Thursday night. And every time she comes in, it's personalized. I feel special. Hey, Tiffani, come in. It's Thursday night. Boom, the pandemic hits, we go on lockdown. I don't know how to get in touch with Tiffani on Thursday night. And so, whether you're a tire store that, a customer can actually look online, find the tire they want, order, schedule a installation time and show up, and you can message them via text message and say, hey, we're running 15 minutes late, like all those things. That's an example of the lack of investments that were made ahead of 2020 really came to a head, which is why digital transformation in all industries is accelerating, because all of a sudden, many companies and verticals were caught flat-footed without making these investments. So going back to what you just said, if I was a franchisee of a restaurant, right, and they weren't digitizing and they didn't have relationships with Uber Eats and all of these things, and they weren't doing digital and they weren't capturing customer information, should I have done it? Because if I waited for them, look what happened, right? I sell, I'm using this as totally as an example, right? I sell Goodyear tires, and I get them from Goodyear, and I'm an agent, but I have a tire store, I don't have a Goodyear store, I have a tire store. But Goodyear wasn't giving me these things. Once again, this is an example. So I'm not saying this is what Goodyear is doing. That had I already gone online, wouldn't I have been in a better position than if the guy down the street that was a Goodyear shop that didn't have it, right? Once again, an example.
Well, we just signed Goodyear as an account, so that's a perfect example, right? So they're now none of our clients. Now, look, I think that all makes total sense. I'll use two examples, right? One of the largest appliance stores, high-end appliance stores down there in your area, down in Orange County, they figured out they need to get to know their customers. And by the way, they still have some people coming inside, but high-end stuff, so much more is sold online. And they were realizing that they didn't know their customers,
right? And
they had to get to know them to move forward. And they adapted. This one organization adapted very, very quickly. Same thing with an insurance agent. 70-year-old guy. He's a friend of mine. He was actually my business mentor down in San Diego. First thing he did, he went and found someone who understood social media, who was an agent. He started he's an owner, and he started recruiting additional agents. And now part of research is, do you understand, are you a digital native? Do you understand this? Can you help my business? It became a key criteria in how he expanded. Here's the challenge he had. This is why I think they're disconnected. He was doing all this work and he was improving his sales, getting to know his customer, and he was afraid to use his co-op dollars because the way the guidelines were set up, he was afraid that if he didn't do it right, he wasn't going to get his money back. And so he sort of pushed it to side. So he's doing all this innovative things on sales, but the vendor wasn't meeting him in the middle to maximize those dollars. And then they're coming to us going, nobody's using our MDF dollars. I'm like, there's got to be a meeting ground somewhere.
Well, you nailed it. There was exactly, you just completely validated everything I just said over the last sort of 10 minutes, right? It is this, doing it on your own. The vendor's not sort of leading the way. And so if you are waiting for them to say, I want more, you should be hiring more digital people, or you should be doing things online, or you should, my insurance agent, same thing. Still very kind of 1995, great guy, like him, been handling me for a long time, but it's still like sometimes his email bounces because his email box is too full because he doesn't have enough storage. I'm like, good God, it is 2020, right? You're killing me. Like, I love doing business with you because you know me, you take care of me. But the expectations now I have are so much more than he has, been willing to invest in. So I finally convinced him that, you at least need to get more email storage so that doesn't happen. But of course, the reason it was happening, because everybody does everything via fax, signature, paper, not DocuSign. And so those big files are coming into his email box, and you get 10 or 20 customers that send that in a day. Boom, you're stuffed, right? And
right.
So anyway, let's go back to selling. This is why I think you have to understand what is the product and service you're selling, who is your target customer, how do they want to buy? And over the last 8 months, the buying habits across every single industry, for the most part, is totally changed. And we don't think, actually, from the research we've been doing, that the habits will swing back. We think it's going to stay somewhere in between where it was and where it is. But McKinsey just came out with some new research recently that showed these bands of what customers are now willing to spend dollar-wise online. 0 to 50,000, 50 to 250, 250 to $500,000, above $1 million. They are seeing the above $500,000 spend now significantly higher on the amount of customers that are willing to do that digitally, where before it used to be face-to-face, I need to have a meeting, I want to see all this. And so that is showing that the way in which we sell. Look, I was giving a presentation at a channel event, maybe 8 years ago, and it was a big channel partner, and it was their sales kickoff. And it was the largest, pretty much the largest partner for a major networking company that I've already mentioned here. And I was standing on stage and I said, look, the customer has changed. The expectations have changed. Sales has not kept pace. Literally, I got boos. They were like, right? And I'm like I've been on stage a lot. I'm like, this is the first time I've gotten some boos. Like, okay, so I was a little taken aback, and then I went like, okay, let me understand why this is. So I sort of tried to navigate the conversation. And when it was over, the CEO of the company came up to do a quick fireside chat with me, 10 minutes that lasted an hour, by the way, because there was, 2,000 people in the audience, and people were asking questions, and some were very offended at my comment. Finally, like 20 minutes in, thankfully, a woman stood up in the back row, and she's just like, hi, I'm in, sales enablement. And I can tell you that like our enablement presentation and deck hasn't changed in 2 years. And I'm like, that's what I mean. I'm not saying you as individuals, right? I'm not saying we haven't, gone from solution selling to spin selling to challenger selling to whatever selling. Like we've been trained differently in all of that. But I'm talking about the processes, the technology, like the interaction between sales and marketing and customer service, and the single source of truth of data being shared amongst those groups so you can be more informed and bring more insight to your interactions with your customers. That's what I mean by sales not keeping pace. It's not us as individuals. We just can't keep pace in a human-only mentality, you have to start to use technology. And since that presentation, it never fit. So the 2 years after that, by the way, they put a picture of me. I know I didn't go back, but they put a picture of me up, and it literally said, "Sales has not changed." And like the first year back, people were like, "Oh," and then the second year back, people were like, and I still get emails after everything. It's been 8 years now, 7 to 8 years. I still get emails from the executive team going, every sales kickoff, we always make sure we pay homage to the 2-hour presentation that was supposed to be 30 minutes when I offended by saying I didn't think sales was keeping pace.
Well, so once again, I go back to, so you've got the resellers, whether it's agents or partners, wherever they are, and you got the vendor, and you definitely identified a sore spot there, right? So whose responsibility is to close that gap? And I'm just curious who's owning that, because you could look at it a couple different ways. I think you could say, hey, this is what it is. These guys need to get it together. We'll send them some stuff, or you can take responsibility for it. Doesn't mean you have to own everything, but you can take responsibility for it. And do you put a plan together to close that gap? And who are your top partners that you can get from here to there? And who are the ones in the middle that can go to here? And honestly, who are the ones who are going to cast off? Because if they're never going to adopt the sales, you can do all the top of the funnel stuff in the world, but if they can't close deals, they're never going to win the business, and particularly in today's world.
Yeah, so I actually coined the term the seller's dilemma many, many years ago at Gartner, and I used it in my book, Growth IQ, as well, to talk about where I thought the answer to that was. And I played on Clayton Christensen's Innovator's Dilemma. And the seller's dilemma was, as a sales leader, how do you run the business, i.e., deliver quota, forecast, pipeline meetings, like go out there and win deals today, which, by the way, is securing your job and your people's job and the revenue for the business, while at the same time you're going, where do I think selling is going to be 18 or 24 months from now? And how do I start to prepare my team, my people, myself for that transformation? How much time are you spending on running the business versus how much are you spending on transforming the business? And unfortunately, most, sales manager level are full-time in run the business. As you get higher in the organization, if you're a good sized company, mid enterprise, you will have multiple layers. As you get higher, they're spending less time running and more time sort of thinking. But you have to get a really specific kind of sales leader who spends 25 or 30% of their time thinking about what's the future selling models, and then 70 or 75% of the time, right, thinking about running the business. I can't tell you how many meetings I've had with the largest selling leaders in the globe. And they spend 95% of their time running the business and 5% of their time planning for the future, because they're like, look, I could plan for the future, but if I don't do what I need to do today, I won't have my job. And so when I would talk to them about transformation, they'd be like, I actually agree with everything you just said, but I need you to help me figure out, how do I close more business this quarter? I'm like, the problem is that the decisions you made this quarter happened a year and a half ago. You can't course correct fast enough with enough volume. You can get a little bit of lift, but with enough volume to be meaningful. So, there's a quote in my book from Jeff Bezos that says, look, if we have a good quarter, it's because of the decisions we made 2 to 3 years ago, not the decisions we made today, which is why I wrote the book Growth IQ, because growth to me is a thinking game. And so you have to outthink. How far in advance are you starting to think what's going to happen? And you may not be right, but you have to give yourself a shot.
And that reminds me of a webinar you did. Here's an opportunity to plug that webinar if you would like, because you talked about 10 trends. And in a podcast, we can't go through all 10. Maybe we can talk about a couple of them. But I think everybody should listen to that, because what you just talked about hit home more to me, having been a sales leader in my life, and nothing's more frustrating than being a sales leader. Understanding that fact and feeling like you can't act on it or not willing to take that risk. And when I look back on my career from 10 years ago, the one thing over the last 15 years, the one thing I think about on how I would do differently would have been putting those strategic ideas in place and having the gumption, or whatever you want to call it, to actually enact a lot of that stuff. And that's what I think. Not closing a deal. It's like, how could I have done better strategy?
Yeah. And look, you're not alone. You're not alone. And so, my advice to people that are listening to this that go, is just map out a week. And how much time do you spend running the business versus how much time do you spend thinking on the future of the business? And that'll at least give you a starting point. And then to your example, look, it's not that you know what's going to happen. It's maybe listening to podcasts or a webinar or reading a book or going to an online virtual event or whatever the case might be, where you're getting these new ideas to just understand what do you think the trends are going to be, and then do they resonate with you? Are they something that would have impact on it? So should you be thinking about it? Should you test it? And that's what we have to sort of give ourselves permission on, is what we call kind of this beginner's mind, is give yourself 10 or 15% space in your day to imagine and reimagine and reinvent what you're doing today. Because for sure, any leader that's listening to this, you are at a fork in the road. You are either going to go back to the status quo, which is where we came from, or you're going to take this opportunity to reimagine what the future is going to look like. And if you go back to the status quo, I worry that you're going to become less and less relevant. If you find a way to ease into reimagining the future with technology and process and people and partnerships, I think you're going to be in a much better position 2021 and beyond.
Well, and by the way, and that webinar is on your website, so people can go to your website and they can download it and listen to it, and where you can go through all 10 of those, right? Once again, since we don't have time to go through all of them today. So how do you connect the dots, right? So when I'm listening to, I've sold direct and I've sold through the channel. And so I try to be thinking about, okay, what would I do directly as a head of sales or CRO and running my business? And if I've got a channel, and then how do I empower my channel then? Because everything that I'm doing, I would love the CRO or whoever they call it at those big partners to be right in lockstep with me. We're right together. And some of these partners are really big, some really small. But either way, how do we get them thinking that same way?
Well, first and foremost, it isn't about you. It's about the customer. So as a CRO of a brand who wants another CRO to be in complete lockstep with them when they don't work for them is unrealistic, because you are not the only person that partner company might be representing. So if you just, pick tires or whatever, it's 5 different brands potentially. And if you're in technology, for sure, it's a lot of brands. And so you're getting pulled in a lot of directions. So the direction you go in as a CRO is, who's our customers? What are they looking for from us? And so you might have great products and you might have great programs, but the customers they have today, it's not a fit. And so no matter how hard you try to convince them to sell your product, sell more of it, use the MDF and the co-op and take the training and do all that, they're just like, it's not a fit for me. So the challenge is we cannot force our partners to be in lockstep with us, because that may not be the direction they need to go in. So what I used to tell CROs or sales leaders or channel leaders who are trying to increase the engagement from their channel is find the partners who are engaged. And that's where you spend your time. Don't try and convince those. And I'm just going to use cloud as an example. I mean, there are years that went by that some of the largest tech companies in the world were trying to convince all of their channel partners to go to the cloud. And they weren't going because the customers were not yet demanding that they wanted to go there. So you kind of have to make sure that you are not just aligning with what you want, but you have to understand what that CRO who you're trying to get to come on board and come on this journey with you. I'd spend time, instead of trying to convince, I'd spend time to understand who are their customers. What is their business? Is there even opportunity? If there is an opportunity, move on, go find another one where there's opportunity. But too many times I see channel account managers from the brand that wants to sell get so fixated on the large partners, right? Trying to sell through them and convince them. Take some of that energy and effort and go to those partners who really want to engage with you and want to do the things you want them to do. It's just so much easier. It's like selling to net new customers, don't know you, don't trust you, don't understand your value, versus selling to those that are in your base. Already made a decision, they like you, they're more loyal, they'll try more products and services when you launch them, they're willing to forgive you if something goes wrong. So where would you spend your time? Chasing that new customers that's a longer sales cycle and much more expensive to acquire, or going to your base that has already made a decision? And so, that's why I go back to growth is a thinking game, and so is sort of strategizing around selling.
So, and by the way, when I say lockstep, I didn't mean they have to do everything we do. What I was saying is, if it's smart as a vendor who's leading sales, a CR at a vendor in the channel or channel team, to think strategically on these habits and understand the customer and everything you're talking about. I'm saying the CRO or the head of sales at the vendor or at the partner should be thinking the same way in terms of how do I understand my customer, the end customer, and how to be just a smarter seller. Doesn't mean they have to be 100% lockstep. I was thinking more in lockstep with what are the processes that are going to make me a better seller no matter what I'm selling, not necessarily my product. And so you're improving their IQ and their ability to sell in general versus just your product, or does that even not make sense?
It makes total sense, except the huge assumption in what you just said is that other person is interested and willing and open to hear what you have to say, to give them some advice about what you think they should be thinking about and what you think they should be doing. The challenge is that every company has their own unique culture, their own unique leadership and management style, their own unique, it's sort of the internal workings is the mental model of a company. Rarely do mental models go, hit lockstep. Like people go, we want to be more like Salesforce. It's like, well, our mental model is very unique. Many people say we want to learn Salesforce on Salesforce so we can learn how to do this. But when you watch the cultural conversation happen, even though we're leading the horses to water, doesn't mean they're going to go and drink. I'm just going to pick digital transformation as an example. I can tell you how long I have. 15 years been talking about digitally transforming industries. COVID hits, all of a sudden everyone's like, oh my God, we got to digitally transform. And they understand the reason why. But it's like, I've been telling you the sky is blue for a really long time. And you were like, nope, it's different for us. Our sky is green, And so I just say to you that I'm not saying what you were sharing isn't valuable. You have to make sure that they are open and willing to hear what it is you have to say. Going back to what I said, giving yourself 15% time and permission to hear new points of view so you can rethink what you're doing requires a very specific kind of leader. Not everybody is open to that. They'll say, this is the way we've always done it. It's the way we're going to continue to do it. And worse is they're growing. Then they're definitely not interested in what you have to say.
Okay. All right. My final point on that one is those 10 points that you make, which you go through what's changing in the world today of sales, I think affects anybody who sells anywhere. Maybe that's the way to come at it. We're not trying to tell you what to do, but as I listened to your webinar, it made me think just in generality of what's going on in the world. And as any sort of sales leader, if you want to understand your customer, I just thought they were really 10 really good points, no matter where you're selling, right?
And it was really the future of sales 2020, and then the pandemic hit. And so I had to adjust some of it because I had one that was, I felt like AI, and when we sort of feel like AI is going to increase sales roles, not decrease sales roles. And, I felt that would have been insensitive to put something out about increasing in jobs while people were losing jobs. So right. I had to make some adjustments. But for all intent and purposes, those predictions are just really the net of it is trying to give yourself that time to think about how I've sold in the past. Will it still work in the future? How has my customers changed? More importantly, how have my sellers and employees changed? And what do I need to do to make them successful? And some of it is collapsing teams, which was one of the trends, using AI and salespeople as the new power couple, which is another one of them. Others is really thinking differently about sort of how you prepare sort of the process side of selling. So you're right. It is really kind of cross-functional and cross-industry. And if one of them resonates with you out of the 10, then I've been successful. Rarely is kind of all 10 going to resonate, but I just need one to land so that maybe it can get you to think a little bit differently.
Well, you got me thinking, and you got me thinking as a sales leader. And I actually forwarded that to so many people because the thing that really hit home to me, and I don't know how many listeners will feel this, is in this time, selling to your existing customers is a great way to go. But what I'm seeing is people preparing very poorly for that. For instance, one of our vendors lined up all these meetings on quote thought leadership, and they were pitching their services, but they never took the time to ask me, what did I need? They had this 5 pitch idea, lined up 5 meetings and 5 consulting things they could do for me, but they never looked at my circumstance around budget, timelines. They said, oh, they're a really good customer. We'll just line this up and we'll pitch all this stuff. And after the third one, I was like, what do you do? Why are you doing this? Do you understand any of this? And And it was the weirdest thing. It's like they took half that idea, but they didn't prepare. They didn't know me. But they just assumed they could sell that because I'd been an existing customer multiple years.
Well, I'll tell you what we did, because I think people Salesforce, obviously we're big, we sell a lot, we're very successful on the selling side. Is kind of April, May timeframe. Mark Benioff, our CEO, we're all in lockdown, all of our field sales, everyone's grounded. Like, mind you, I flew 375,000 miles last year, 600,000 kilometers, 100 keynotes on 6 continents. I'm grounded. So this is very unusual for lots of us. And then on the sales side, equally sort of everybody being grounded. So he said, what is it that we can do to make sure that we stay connected to our customers, we keep our people engaged, and we find out what it is that our sort of ecosystem, our broader shareholder community will want from us. So Mark gave us a challenge to have 1 million conversations. Not 1 million sales calls, not 1 million demos, not 1 million, PowerPoint presentations, 1 million conversations across 55,000 employees. We ended up having about 1.5 million. So he raised it to 5 million because that's kind of how it works. If you blow it out, it must have been too low of a number. So now it's 5 million. But through the 1.5 million conversations, here's what happened. We put together a program. So everyone was enabled on how to have the call, what to ask, what to look for, then inputting what was heard, what was found, et cetera, right? That led us, by the way, to launch 5 new products during COVID, to reorganize the company in some business units, open recs for 4,000 new people, again, during the pandemic, all because of these 1 million conversations of telling us, to your point, what do people want? They didn't know what you wanted, but here's the 5 things we're going to push you. And so we launched products that were getting people back to the office safely, contact tracing, to tie together with that. Our service app, that if you have service field people going out into the field, we have a mapping software that will show you what are the hot spots in the area from a COVID perspective, trying to keep people safe, because we had it in various parts of our clouds, but we hadn't packaged it together this way. Once we learned what the customers wanted, that's what we did. So I would say to everyone who's listening to this, regardless of what Stephen and I just said, I challenge your team, your company, to do X amount of conversations. It depends what size you are, 100, 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, whatever. And ask a series of questions, not about the product, but about kind of what are the jobs to be done that they'll need in the future? How could you, what are they looking for? What are they struggling with? And if you can then capture that and analyze it and look for the signals and patterns, you may actually be able to launch a new product that helps solve some really big problems for companies right now. That's the way to approach it, versus coming up with the 5 products and trying to push it through your channel when you don't even know what they need.
Well, and it's not like I'm traveling. Okay, I only did a little less than 200,000. So I didn't hit your numbers, but quite a lot caught of that last year. So I'm actually around a little bit more. So I actually can take some of those calls and can listen to that. And by the way, it was interesting. After that experience, I got a call from a couple of people in that organization. It kind of filtered up and then did take the time. So they worked it backwards and they finally got it right. I've got to say they adjusted remarkably well.
That's great.
They did. And I went, okay, this is good, right? And we can end up in a good place. They could have started that way.
Yep.
And I'm definitely around for that. I think a lot of people are open today because we're not traveling as much to having those conversations and building that trust and that rapport. I think that's totally doable. Hey, so last point as we wrap this up, and I think this ties in well to it. I love the social selling, not the social selling. I'm sorry, the social responsibility selling. Sorry, yes. I've been in too many social selling ones.
That's okay.
The social responsibility piece. I think that's really powerful. How important do you see that being today?
So in my book, the first chapter was customer experience, which we were basically just talking about, right? Going out, talking to your customers, finding out what they need, et cetera. The last chapter in my book was Unconventional Strategies, which was really around doing well by doing good, and business is the greatest platform for change. And that's really a quote from our CEO, Mark Benioff. And I then said, watching what we do here at Salesforce is what's the values of the brand? What's our culture? And how does that embed in the way in which our sellers sell? So we could lead with, here's what we're doing around sustainability. Here's what we're doing around equality, especially if it means a lot to the customer you're trying to sell to. So you're aligning on values. You're aligning on the way that you sort of behave, the way that you are attacking the UN's SDGs, whatever the sustainable development goals, if you don't know what they are. And so, ultimately that to me is for salespeople, not to just be more empathetic, but leading with that value-based selling. And when I say value, I don't mean product value. I mean corporate culture value, right? Being a citizen in the community. So much is happening with the business roundtable, purpose over profit. How do we start to really think differently about, capitalism? And that is really where if salespeople are the messengers for companies in front of customers, you have to make sure your sellers know what that means. So if your customer is like, look, they just announced their sustainability goals for 2030, and they're really close to what yours are, what a great conversation, right? We align on values. We align on sustainability. Okay, wow, that's really great. I view you as more than just a commodity-based supplier. I now see you as a partner. What are you guys doing around sustainability? Like, let's put our executives together. Now, all of a sudden, you're having very different conversations. And so that's what really gets me excited is that we're now, regardless of 2020, it was already starting to happen. And then, 2020 comes out. And then, of course, now we're having all kinds of very different conversations about, what brands' positions are on Black Lives Matter and social issues and all kinds of things. And so I think that this is a great opportunity for sellers to think about how can they weave that into their day-to-day in an authentic way. If you approach it inauthentically, it will backfire on you really quickly.
Well, I think this is a great opportunity, and it makes so much business sense, right? And getting a cultural fit, I think there's a stickiness to that that becomes part of a true partnership. And I totally agree. But once again, it has to be genuine and authentic as you go through that. So, well, Tiffani, thank you for joining us. I really appreciate you taking a lot of time with us today.
Sure, Stephen. Thank you for having me. Look, I could talk about sales in the channel all day long. And if I can tell my ketchup story, it's been a good day.
So a lot of people who are listening know you, but what's the best way for people to get connected with you?
So I'm pretty active on social. I'm really active on LinkedIn. So follow me on LinkedIn, follow me on Twitter. I'm also on Instagram. It's at Tiffani_Bova, and Tiffani is spelt with an I at the end. I have a podcast called What's Next with Tiffani Bova on all the streaming platforms. It's one of the top performers on iTunes. And then I have my book, Growth IQ, which is now translated in 9 languages. So she is making her way around the globe, even though I am not. So that's probably the best. But I'd love to hear back, anything that you agree, disagree with what we talked about here today. It helps shape what I do. Listen, my job is to be an evangelist of what I hear out there in the marketplace, and listening is part of that. So if you've got a point of view, I'm always open to hear it.
Okay, thank you. Listeners, thank you for joining us today. If you've got any comments or feedback for us, please do reach out to us at 360 Insights or at Channel Edge at 360 Insights. And please do recommend this to your friends. Please share. And you can find all of these podcasts and all these downloads at iTunes, Stitch Radio, wherever you get your great content. So once again, thank you, folks.
Thanks for listening to Channel Edge, brought to you by 360 Insights, the channel success platform. Subscribe now on iTunes, Stitcher Radio, and Google Play, and you'll always be the first to access new episodes where channel leaders share success strategies, best practices, and emerging trends. For bookings, feedback, questions, or comments, feel free to email us at channeledge@360insights.com.